respectful. I think we pretty much have everybody in. I just wanted to make sure before I see there's maybe one other person. Welcome, Rhoda from Louisville. I was just there not too long ago. John from Hartford. Oh, two folks from Hartford, the ATL. Thank you, Adrian, for joining us. Oh, look at all of this. Awesome, awesome. So I am going to go ahead and get us started. I am excited that we get to come together again. This time of community is always so wonderful and beautifully special. As you know, or you may not know, I am Bishop Marcia Dinkins, the founder and executive director of Black Women Rising and the Black Appalachian Coalition. And I'd like to welcome you to the second of our 5-part Lunch and Learn series on petrochemicals, presented by the Black Appalachian Coalition and the Ohio River Valley Institute. Just to kind of recap, last month we learned about the sources and uses of petrochemicals, the history of the petrochemical industry, coal, I can't talk today, y'all, oil and gas, fuels, and the lost opportunities and the cost of petrochemicals. As many of you know or may not know, petrochemicals, oil and gas, are used to make plastics and pesticides. They are harmful to our health and our environment. And the process of making petrochemicals creates dangerous air and water pollution. People, especially children living near these petrochemical production facilities, they have a higher risk of different cancers, birth complications, asthma, respiratory illness, and kidney disease. And these facilities tend to be located where? In Black communities and poor communities. Why? Because of decades of racial discrimination in housing, financial services. In majority Black census tract, the estimated risk of cancer from toxic air emissions is more than twice the risk found in white majority tracts. Research shows in 2021, the United Nations officially declared petrochemical growth along Cancer Alley in the US Gulf Coast as a form of, get this, environmental racism. And this is why we're here, because we fight, but sometimes we don't know what we're fighting for or why we're fighting. And I'm just honored that we're able to put on this series. And I'm even doubly honored because you are joining us for this series. And not only having you join us, but today also having, again, Patty DeMarco joining us and Dr. Claire Cohen, who will speak to the direct and indirect health harms of petrochemicals. I am not going to spend a lot of time talking. They will take a minute and introduce themselves, and they'll take, and give you an overview of what's going to happen. I want this to be rich conversation as well as an opportunity for you all to be able to ask questions, get information, and, get your lunch, get your water, get your tea, get your coffee, get your chips. If you're anything like me, get your chocolate chip cookie. And then let's hear from the wonderful Patty DeMarco and Dr. Claire Cohen. Welcome, Patty. Welcome, Dr. Cohen. How are you?
Oh, we're wonderful. And Ben can put my slides up. We can do introductions from there. So thank you so much for joining us for this second session of empowering our independence from petrochemicals. And we're going to be looking at the health harms today. And could you have the next slide, please? We have a whole series planned here. And this is in the context of understanding how we are affected by these petrochemicals. And then we're going to be getting into what we can control, what better choices we might have, and an action plan for being better informed and better empowered to move forward. So I'm Patty DeMarco. I'm involved with the Reimagine Appalachia Caucus, which is how I found Marcia Dinkins. And I am a Borough Council member from the Borough of Forest Hills. Claire, would you introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. I'm Dr. Claire Cohen. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I moved to Pittsburgh in 1984 and fell in love with the region and have been practicing not only in Pittsburgh, but all over Western Pennsylvania since then. So I've had I've worked in a wealth of environments, from special schools. Right now I'm working in a hospital, to clinics, to, I've been all over the place, many counties. I also have helped to raise, I had a sister who died of lymphoma, and helped to raise 6 of her 8 children, because they were still minors.
Mhm.
For a while, and they're all grown now. But despite all that, believe it or not, I've also always been very active in my community, doing a lot of stuff recently. In the recent years, I've been doing stuff mainly around school, the prison pipeline. I'm a member of Pittsburgh Green New Deal, so some stuff around environmental stuff. And the biggest thing I've been doing is around health justice, trying to get universal access and to healthcare to everybody, not just some people, quality healthcare. And I belong to a group called the Western PA Coalition for Single Payer Healthcare, and that's where I do that.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good,
that's
thank
what-
you. So I'm going to do an overview of how petrochemicals harm our health, and then Claire is going to give you some detailed information from her lived experience and from her practice. So next slide, please, Ben. So if you have questions, if you could put them in the chat as we go along, and then Ben and Marcia can help to screen those and make sure we have a chance to bring those up. I want to note that air pollution in particular disproportionately affects people of color across the vast majority of emission sources, including industry, gas and diesel fueled motor vehicles, and construction. And this has been pretty much universal around our whole country, but in particular in areas where these petrochemical facilities are located. Next slide, please. So we all know that cigarette smoke and alcohol are bad for us, but there are a lot of other substances in our environment, and many of them come from the petrochemical industry. We know that we're exposed for everything from ultraviolet radiation in the sun to indoor air that is contaminated, to metals that are in our water. But a lot of the things in the form of pesticides and toxics, polyfluorocarbonated things, dioxins and particulate matter, many of these are associated with the petrochemical industry. Next, please. So petrochemicals cause pollution at all phases of their extraction, all the way down to their use and disposal. From the point of fracking natural gas, you have exposures to not only the fumes, but also you get silicosis from the sand that blows around, from the propellant that they inject underground. Mountaintop removal mining creates vast swaths of really moonscapes, but it also contaminates the land and the water. You get derailments and contaminations from spills from the transportation system, and also the refining process, where you take these raw materials and turn them to refined products. You have contamination coming from all of those, as well as the point where you're burning power, burning fuels to make power, or using them to make materials. And also, when you dispose of those materials, you also create pollution from that sources as well. Next slide, please. So when air pollution has a number of sources, including natural sources such as fires, volcanoes, and lightning, but fossil fuel combustion from power plants, industries, sewage treatment, residential and commercial heating and cooking, as well as transportation from cars, trucks, railroads, shipping, buses, motorcycles, as well as agriculture. They put a number of materials up into the ground, up into the air rather, that combine in the air, and distant source materials can combine and mix in the atmosphere and end up making different compounds, so that when it comes down in the precipitation, or when it becomes formed in with the clouds or with the atmosphere, it becomes toxic even more than it was on its initial emission. This is things like smog, Sometimes you get inversions, and we've had red alerts and orange alerts in Pittsburgh, for example, when these materials are held close to the ground and they become very toxic to breathe. But you have a number of sources that combined together are worse than any one of them by themselves. Next, please. There also are major air pollutants that we need to recognize and be aware of. The biggest one is carbon dioxide, which comes out in the rate of 48 million tons per year and is the major contributor to climate change, which also has health harms or exacerbates health harms. The other major concern is volatile organic compounds, which we emit 15 million tons per year across the country. And you can see from this map some of the areas where the darker red show counties that have the worst air pollution. And you see that these are often in areas that are along the Ohio River Valley and also in areas that are heavily industrialized. Nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulates, small particulates, as well as large particulates are also contaminants that can have long-term effects in your lungs, especially the larger ones that form smoke and can get into your lungs, and the very small ones which get all the way deep into your tissues and can lodge there for many years. Next slide, please. So within the regulations which regulate each chemical separately, under permitted processes, the petrochemical facilities are permitting over 500,000 pounds of toxic pollutants into the Ohio River Basin within Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. And among these things are benzene, vinyl chloride, trichloroethylene, and over 100 other chemicals. And these are facilities in our area from which these are emitted. Next slide. So there is also water pollution coming from these facilities. There are 81 refineries across the country that discharge 15 million pounds of nitrogen, 60,000 pounds of selenium, and 1.6 billion pounds of chlorides, sulfates, and other dissolved water solids into our waters. They're also releasing plastic resins and forever chemicals, synthetic fibers, benzene salts, oil and grease, and metals like aluminum, zinc, and lead. They have a number of complex chemicals, dimethylfluoramide, and microplastics. Many of these materials are released into the water supply and can become contaminants in rivers and streams and lakes from which we take our water supply. They can get into soil and contaminate crops, and they can penetrate into drinking water. We'll talk a little bit in our next session about things that you can do to make sure your drinking water is not contaminated, especially with these complex polycarbon chlorides, vinyl chloride, and things of that nature that are highly toxic. Next one. And then finally, you get land pollution from petrochemicals, not only through direct application of pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers, but also spills and leaks, which can be sometimes even deliberately put on the ground as we're using produced water from fracking fields for dust control in Pennsylvania, which allows you to put contaminated water deliberately on the ground to control dust in unpaved roads. Very, very toxic material, but it's been permitted and has been declared safe. You can have illegal dumping, especially of plastics, not only things that are washed up, but people throw things out of their car or out the window, or actually deliberately dump material. If you go and drive along any of the hillsides in Pennsylvania, you can see where people have thrown things out onto the road. Those plastics accumulate in the biosphere, become microplastic, and can be incorporated into our bodies. One of the more alarming things have been the mining and drilling, especially from fracking, where they have suspended 7 environmental and public health protections in order to permit fracking to occur in the first place. The injection of unknown amounts of chemicals we discussed last time in the fracking process. But these things also have health effects as they are returned into the environment, and people cannot be prevented from being exposed to them. And finally, you have Superfund sites, which introduce leachate into the ground. Many of them have been flooded or damaged by heavy storms in ways that they were not intended to be protected from. So we've been developing exposure from these things in ways that we had not anticipated. Next slide, please. So it turns out that even though the regulatory process puts limits on each chemical or each pollutant or potential contaminant one at a time, we don't experience those materials one at a time, right? When you breathe in, you breathe whatever is there. When you drink your water, you drink whatever is in it. You don't have the choice of saying, oh, I don't want any of that in my water. You're only allowed to have a little bit. These things interact with each other. They form new compounds. And there have been 167 chemicals found in the biomonitoring studies conducted by the CDC. The average American adult has 167 synthetic chemicals in your body. 76 of these are known to cause cancer in humans or animals. 94 of them are toxic to the brain and nervous system, or they cause birth defects or abnormal development. However, the dangers of exposure to these chemicals in combination has never been studied. And this is something that many people have been clamoring for years, that we change the way we regulate chemicals to account for the fact that we are exposed to a mixture in combination over a long period of time. It was never intended that people be experiencing these chemicals one at a time. They're experienced in combination, and they have synergistic effects, not only in the atmosphere before they reach you or in the water before they reach you, but once they get in your body, they have synergistic effects that we may not understand fully. Next slide, please. So the 3 principal ways, well, really 4 principal ways that you have contamination enter our body are from inhaling. Then this is affected by air pollution and airborne contaminants, by ingesting the polluted water or food from the transport of pollutants, contamination of food in the food chain, or water-soluble pollutants, and even microplastics that have been incorporated into foods that we may be eating that come especially from sea sources. They've been detecting microplastic in shrimp and ocean caught fish in increasing amounts. You can also be contaminated or receive pollution contact by absorbing through your skin. And this is especially important for occupational exposures. For example, if you are a clerk and you handle thermal paper for receipts on a regular basis, such a person will have about 5 times to 10 times higher exposure of bisphenol A in their body because it's absorbed through their hands. If you are a worker in a factory that makes bisphenol A, the levels found in such people are over 1,000 times the standard. And almost every American, 96% of Americans, are found to have bisphenol A in our bodies. This is widely, used in food containers. It was at one time a standard in material in things like sippy cups, any flexible plastic containers, and it is on receipt paper. So this is the kind of thing that, we've been trying to get abolished or banned from use, and without success, because the industry is very strongly opposed to that. It has been banned from certain applications, but not all. You also have physical conditions such as climate change induced heat stress that is particularly dangerous to vulnerable people or people that are exposed occupationally to outdoor conditions. So the fact that the petrochemical fuels contribute significantly to climate change also contributes to the health effects of those in increased physical stressors. Next slide, please. So there are some direct health harms, and the long-term effects can lead to respiratory and cardiovascular system diseases like asthma, hypertension, coronary artery disease, heart attacks, and strokes. Ozone and particulate pollution can cause chest pain, coughing, throat irritation, congestion, and reduced lung function. And children, older adults, persons who already have asthma, and immunocompromised persons are the most vulnerable to these air quality impacts. And the impacts are in the millions. Millions of people have lung function decreasing, inflammation and cardiac effects, or respiratory symptoms that are controlled by medication, such as asthma attacks. And there are tens of thousands who have doctor visits, school absences, lost work days, and thousands yet have ER visits, hospital admissions, heart attacks, and death. And this is where you get health insurance issues of a larger proportion. So it's not a trivial issue. You have millions of people affected by these long-term effects of air pollution. And these have been documented through carefully done National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences studies. Next slide, please. So you also have long-term exposure to things that cause the immune system to be disrupted. You can get airway and respiratory damage from long-term exposure and cardiovascular damage from long-term exposure, and your pulmonary functions can be compromised. And they also find that epigenetic damage and DNA repair are impeded. These are cell functions at the really micro level that have to do with your ability to fight disease and to have immune responses. And it also contributes in the long term to cancer and strokes. So these are things that really have broad, undefined, you can't say your operation made me sick, but the statistical weight of evidence is just massive. People in polluted areas have many more health effects than people who live far from such facilities. And it's harder and harder to find places that are immune from or separated or safe from these kinds of emissions. Next slide, please. In the water pollution, health harms are also associated with higher risk of cancers, especially in bone, brain, liver, bladder, breast, and pancreas. And they're also associated with adverse birth outcomes, such as preterm birth, low birth weight, miscarriages, stillbirth, and birth defects. And there have also been associated with chronic kidney disease, especially glomerulonephritis, and endocrine disruption, which is developmental and reproductive health disruptions. This is becoming a huge issue because so many of the petrochemical compounds have mimics of hormonal activity that make them act like hormones in your body. They will block normal hormone function, they will cause abnormal hormonal responses, or completely disrupt the normal functioning of your endocrine system. And these are now becoming quite frequent in the population. They are, again, you can't say your chemical made me sick, but the statistical evidence is piling up and piling up. And these are kinds of things that have been documented over long periods of time by highly reliable research sources, which I've put here. Next slide, please. These are some examples of endocrine disrupting chemicals, certainly herbicides, fungicides, some metals, and these are most often associated with burning coal, insecticides of various sorts, industrial chemicals. Top of the list is bisphenol A. Cadmium is another one that you'll find often in abandoned mine lands. All of these things are pretty common in the environment now. Next slide, please. And the reasons we should be concerned is that evidence of endocrine disruption is mounting in the general population, and restrictions on the petrochemical industry are fought vehemently by multinational corporations that are vested in continuing to use these fossil resources, and especially shifting from fuel combustion to plastics production, which is responsible for a tremendous number of endocrine disrupting compounds from the list that you just saw. And the worst of this is that people are exposed without their awareness many times, and certainly without their consent. I mean, if you were asked, is it okay for us to be exposed to tiny concentrations or cumulative concentrations of these harmful chemicals, would any of you say yes? I doubt it. But the regulatory process has not properly reflected the weight of evidence for things like the increase of testicular cancer, breast cancer, sex organ deformities, and declining sperm count. This is in North America and this is in Europe. This is very alarming to many people. And if you look at the statistics, 1 in 5 families in our country have trouble with fertility. And this is an issue that, you know, can possibly be associated with the enormous amount of endocrine disrupting contaminants that are in our water and air. And this is based on the work of Linda Birnbaum at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. She's been a published researcher for many, many, many years. Next slide, please. So the health harms from climate change are largely and most significantly dependent from petrochemicals. They change the air and water quality and exacerbate respiratory illnesses. They cause heat stress, especially among outdoor workers, especially agricultural outdoor workers who often don't even have shade. They have an increase in the range and viability of disease vectors like mosquitoes, ticks, and bacteria that normally might be killed off in a cold winter, but now are able to survive or even thrive during the all seasons. We have an increase in transmission of infectious diseases, again, because the warmer temperatures are more conducive to bacterial infections and also to bacterial contamination of water and land. And there are increased dangers from disasters like floods, fires, and drought. And this, unfortunately, comes mostly to vulnerable communities, which is predominantly communities of color, and older adults, low-income communities, and children. These are the areas that are most likely to be affected by these kinds of things. And there's also now a prevailing mental distress from apprehension about the climate future. I see this among my students, and we are going to talk about this in the next session or two about how we can take control of the situation and feel less apprehensive and more empowered to take action. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my last slide. We need a healthy environment to have healthy people. And if you live within a mile of petrochemical facilities, 18 to 22% of children have asthma compared to 8 to 11% nationally. Pregnancy-related maternal mortality is 41% compared to 13.7% averaged nationally. And if you look only at people of color, that number is even bigger. Life expectancy is reduced and income growth is slowed in communities where petrochemical facilities are located. And there's a substantial risk factor for many negative outcomes in individuals' whole life, such as a deficit hyperactivity disorders, asthma, lower test scores, lower schooling attainment, lower earnings, and higher rates of social welfare program participation. So what we need to look at is shifting the regulatory framework from permitting how much toxin is allowed to be put into the air, water, and soil to a regulatory framework instead that has a focus on approving only non-toxic materials and benign production systems. In other words, instead of trying to titrate how much hazardous stuff we should be exposed to, we should be focusing on how we can limit the toxicity altogether and only permit things that are benign by design and that are biodegradable and don't cause harm to people who use these materials or people who are exposed to them occupationally. So I'm going to end here and turn this over to Claire. Next slide. I think that was my last slide, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, good.
Yes.
So Claire, the floor is yours.
Okay, so since I'm out of town, I don't have any slides. I was traveling and I didn't know how this was going to end up. I'm going to start with just reading a short passage from another talk I gave, and then I'm going to talk some about asthma, maternal and infant mortality, congenital endocrine-related disorders, and then some psychiatric illnesses that ADHD, autism, intellectual disability, and learning disorders, and then end up with a little bit about catastrophic climate events, and then what we should be thinking about addressing, given what we're increasingly learning about the climate. So this short passage: to understand the impact of climate change in the United States and efforts to address it, it is crucial to understand it in the context of racial capitalism. To put it in plain English, if you are poor and working class, your life isn't considered as valuable. And if you are poor, working class, and Black or brown, the value of your life is considered even less. In the United States, Black, brown, and indigenous poor and working class people have always been disproportionately impacted by the environmental degradation of industries, including fossil fuel extractive industries like coal, steel, so on, industrial and petrochemical plants like that plastic plant that's being just recently opened in Beaver County, military testing sites, and by being frontline workers in jobs that leave people vulnerable to climate impacts, such as agricultural workers, delivery drivers, healthcare workers, and sanitation workers. Black and other people of color not only disproportionately work in and near such hazardous sites, they also disproportionately live near them. These spaces, these living spaces, include homes, neighborhoods, job sites, schools, and carceral spaces. In other words, jails and prisons. Allegheny County Jail is right next to I-376. In addition, the impact of climate change and environmental degradation on the living and working spaces of poor and working class people, particularly poor and working class people who are Black and people of color, are less likely to be addressed and often even completely and intentionally neglected. To be honest, the biggest thing I've had experience with in terms of the impact that it's clearly and definitely related to climate degradation is asthma. I see people from a variety of places, but you should know that Pennsylvania, of which 3/4 of it is in Appalachia, is the third highest state for asthma for children in the country. And Allegheny County, for Black children, has the highest incidence of asthma in the country. 33%, or 1/3 of Black children in Allegheny County have asthma. 1 in every 3 Black kids. And I can believe it, because there was a long period of time where I worked in a special school for kids with behavior problems, and it seemed like every Black kid came in and had asthma. They were forgetting their inhaler, or they were missing days of school because they had to go to the emergency room for a nebulizer. And you may say, well, it's an illness. What would that have to do psychiatrically? Well, when you have asthma, you can't play sports. It limits your ability to go out and play, and you may have to stay indoors on a nice sunny day if the air is bad. One of the issues we have here in Pittsburgh, and I've seen a lot of this, we have a place called the Clairton Coke Works, and it seems to have a lot of problems where it puts out a lot of pollution. And I looked it up, and there have been studies that show that people who live within a 10-mile radius of the Clairton Coke Works are very increased risk of asthma. And guess what? There's a lot of Black kids, and especially it's getting worse because as Pittsburgh, the city, is being gentrified, a lot of Black kids are being moved into places like Clairton, like McKeesport, like these places, these poor suburbs close to or near Clairton. And you're seeing this increased incidence of times where kids can't even go out. And this is not a trivial thing for children. I can tell you, play is the work of childhood. Getting outside is important for children's health and their growth. And so I see a lot of kids that's impacted. And I've seen little boys who wanted to be on football, neighborhood football or basketball teams and couldn't be because of their asthma. And so that's a big issue. Another thing, some other issues that I want to bring up where there is evidence that climate degradation and the pollution play a role, but you can't, with asthma, you can say this was caused by you're living near this bus depot. I have a lot of Black kids for some reason who live near bus depots or living near a big highway. And according to the Pennsylvania Health Department, poor Black kids are disproportionately more likely to live close to power plants and industrial plants. So I have a lot of kids, and that is clear. But some of these other things I'm going to mention, there's a lot of evidence that pollution plays a role, but for any one case, and this is hard sometimes for parents to understand. For any one case, I can't say, well, this caused your kid's ADHD or their congenital effect. But we know there's studies showing that this is having an effect, that kids who are exposed to not only lead, but also pesticides, for example, and other chemicals have a higher incidence of ADHD, of autism, of learning disabilities. So I see a lot of kids like that. And it impacts a kid's functioning in life. ADHD is and autism, this data seems to indicate that they are definitely, people have felt that they're increasing, and that they probably are, because you can show that in areas where there's a lot of pollution, and you can definitely, we've known for a long time that when there's lead in the water, you have an increase in ADHD. That's a major cause. You can show you have an increase in these disorders. And so the question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we doing to our kids when we're allowing them to be exposed to these things? And then there's, to backtrack a little bit to physical disabilities, there's a disorder called hypospadias. And it's a little bit complicated to explain, but because of the way the male baby forms in the uterus, in the womb, the urine tube, the urethra, doesn't start out near the tip of the penis. It has to grow into it, and endocrine hormones, there's some special hormones which are only secreted in utero, which trigger that to happen. So there's been a dramatic increase in this condition called hypospadias. That's where the urine tube, the urethra, doesn't come all the way down to the tip of the penis in little boys. A dramatic increase in boys being born with that. And that is clearly related to all the chemicals in the environment, because many of these chemicals, they particularly disrupt the male hormone, okay? There are also some estrogen disruptors, but they particularly, for some reason, disrupt testosterone. So that's led to an increase in genital formations in male babies. The most common one, and the one that I have the most patients with, is this condition called hypospadias. And of course, human beings have a lot of issues about their genitals, and when yours is abnormal, it causes you to feel stigmatized, to have a lot of issues around that, a lot of questions around yourself and who you are, and so on. I've certainly seen a lot of Black women who have had sudden infant death syndrome. It's not approved that there's not proof that any one individual case is caused by that, but there's certainly some evidence that exposures to these toxins in the environment is playing some role, okay? Also, the the increase in maternal mortality. And as we know, Black women have a higher incidence of maternal mortality. It's 69.6 or 70 Black women per every 100,000 live births. That's as bad as as many third world countries. That's if Black women were their own country, we would be number 90 on the list in terms of all the 190 something countries with in terms of maternal mortality. So I just see a lot of kids who are struggling in school with learning problems and some with even intellectual delay, the increasing number of kids with autism and increasing number of kids with ADHD. And the question becomes, how do you protect kids from this? I tell parents now, if you have an insect infestation in your house, don't just go spraying pesticides willy-nilly, because there's a lot of evidence that can lead that small kids who are exposed to those pesticides you spray, it can cause them to have ADHD and learning disabilities. There's definitely an increased incident. And sometimes when I go to buildings like schools or hospitals, I see them spraying, and I'm saying, oh my goodness, are they thinking about the little kids in there who are down near the floor who are being exposed to this? And then last but not least, in terms of talking about things that I've seen, definitely as we're starting to have more floods and more climate catastrophes, we're definitely, and studies are already showing that, going to be seeing more kids who have trauma from that. In fact, one of my favorite cases was a little boy and his mother who weren't originally from Pittsburgh, but had come up after Katrina. And we now know that Hurricane Katrina was part of this climate change thing, the severity of it. And he and his mother had been caught, and they suffered through Hurricane Katrina, and it clearly it left a traumatic experience for the rest of his life. They didn't know if they were going to survive. They had been rescued in some boat on the top of a house, and we're going to see more and more of that if we don't watch. Now, I'm talking about when I said in the thing I read to you that it's not only that Blacks and other people of color are more disproportionately exposed because of where they work and where they live, but also they are less likely, their issues are less likely to be addressed. It's a well-known fact that Black kids with things like autism get diagnosed at a later age than white kids. Okay, there's been several studies now. So here these kids are, and they're exposed to things that are increasing these disorders, and they're less likely to be diagnosed, and they're more likely to end up being put in the school to prison pipeline for behaviors, because all these things have behavioral impacts. So one of the things that I was involved in Pittsburgh that we fought to make them stop calling the police on kindergartners and first and second graders. We said, you need to look at these kids and see, is there something going on here with them that needs to be treated, rather than giving them a prison charge at 5, 6, and 7 years old. So we, as in our community, and I know that people aren't just from Pittsburgh here, but I know that in Allegheny County, young Black children with these disabilities, young Black children in general, are much more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. And if they have these disabilities, way more likely. Young Black girls, it's 11 times more likely than young white girls, and young Black boys, I think it's 3 or 4 times more likely. So we need to be asking, because the impact is not just these disorders, but how people are responding. We need to be asking, when we have kids that have issues like that, to have these kind of issues and are Black, first of all, are they being addressed as early as white kids are? Are they being picked up? Are people looking at things like what are some of the things that can help to mitigate? I tell a lot of parents to put kids on omega-3 free fatty acids. That supposedly is helpful for brain development. We need to look at things like, do kids live in food deserts? Because when you live in food deserts, you're less likely to get fresh organic vegetables and things that don't have pesticides on them. I have kids who've never had a piece of fresh fruit in their lives. All they've had is this canned stuff and processed stuff. And we know that definitely increases the incidence of all kinds of things, from hypertension to diabetes to thyroid problems. So one of the things I want us to think of is not only what's going on now, but begin to think about how are these things going to impacting our kids now, and what can we do to start to advocate for, and we should be advocating for adults too, but to advocate in particular for an environment safe and healthy for our kids. So I'll just leave it at that. And if there's any questions, I'll try my best to answer them.
Thank you so much, Patty and Dr. Cohen. This is so, this is really, I think, for me and maybe for others too, mind-boggling, informative, extremely helpful. And so what I'd like to do at this moment is, I know there are comments in the chat, but not questions. There was someone who's, basically said, wow, pesticides can cause ADHD, and thanking you for that information. Another one, and Charlene also says that she dealt, with this, with her son when he was 5 years old. Behavior was a big problem. And taking him off of all medications. So, but I'd like to take this time out to open the floor for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can raise your hand. And if you don't have any questions, you take the time to make a comment. So does anybody have questions or comments for Patty or Dr. Cohen?
You did have one question in the chat from Linda Brown, talking about how do we address these environmental concerns with our doctor. And I think, this is a big issue, because I don't know, Claire, if you want to comment on that, but a lot of people in the medical profession are completely oblivious to these issues, and maybe less so nowadays. But I think the Physicians for Social Responsibility have done a good job of trying to educate the profession about these environmental concerns. And they've written several really good public-facing studies that are helpful to people in talking to their doctors about this information.
So I think, unfortunately, a lot of times by the time you're seeing a doctor, the damage has been done. And I don't know that the medical profession at this time has a good answer on how to undo the damage done. So lead poisoning, for example. Once a kid's IQ has been lowered and they have ADHD from it, it's a done deal. You're not going to undo. You can try to you should make sure your kid is less exposed. But I think certainly if you have a newborn or infant, try to raise with your pediatrician talking about what are some of the environmental impact factors that may impact your child's development. And at that point, definitely, how can we mitigate them? If you live near a bus depot or you live near a plant, what are some of the things that can be done to protect your child? When there's these orange and red alert air days that we have in Pittsburgh, certainly bringing up with your pediatrician what can help your child, even if they have asthma, definitely what can you do to help protect them from having an attack? And if your child doesn't have asthma, to protect it from happening. But the biggest thing is people need to advocate for, and that's where one of the things I'm proud that we did in Allegheny County is they wanted to start fracking in the parks. in Allegheny County, and kids play in parks, and kids need to play in parks. And we managed to mobilize the community and stop. I was so proud of us. We showed up, and and the head of the council, the executive of the council, he tried to veto once the council, we mobilized again and got him overridden. So that so that's that's where we can really have an impact. We need to, if you see that they're going to be putting a dump or something near your neighborhood, or a plant near your neighborhood or something, mobilize and get out and say no. And say and that was another Allegheny County. They were going to put this big plant, Amazon plant, in one of the boroughs, and people mobilized and stopped it because they realized they were going to have all these trucks coming in and truck depots and things, and it was going to be right next to a school. Right near a school. I don't know if it was exactly
across the street.
Across the street from a school.
From a school. Yes.
Yes. And people,
I live on that corner.
Yes. And people mobilized. Yes, you do. That's right. And people mobilized and fought. And they said, no, we don't need all of this pollution right where our kids are coming every day to school. So one of the things is, that's probably something where we need, and it's effort and work, but we can mobilize and we can fight. We also had a problem where Pittsburgh, they decide to get this private company to clean the water, and the company ended up increasing the lead in the water. And once again, people had to mobilize to say, no, we don't want that. We don't need some private company that's going to cut corners and increase lead in our water, making our kids sick. So that is probably, and one of the things we need to do is you need to ask your pediatrician or your private your family doctor. You need to say to them, can you sign this petition too? Can you testify too? And some of them might. I mean, I have, when parents have asked me around the school to prison pipeline, I testify at the public hearings and push your doctor. Say, we need your expertise. People need to know that you are, you say you're advocating for kids. We're asking you to come testify too, to come at these public hearings about the damage that is caused. And if you don't know what the damage is, here's information, and you can, in some cases, if they're near me, you can call Dr. Cohen, or you can call this one doctor that did this big report in Pittsburgh. Gentile was her name, Deborah Gentile. There's people that do know, yes, and that can help.
Ned Ketyer as well has testified many times. And it's
yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that. One of the things I want to kind of build up on, and thank you, Dr. Cohen, for even doing the work on the school to prison pipeline. And you said something that's really key. Lead is critical. And for those of you who don't know, years ago, I mean, you don't know this, but years ago, so a couple of years ago in Ohio, we actually pushed for an ordinance, a lead ordinance, because of the fact of the housing stock and how old the housing is, in Ohio and just in the places around this Ohio River Valley. But what you don't know sometimes, and Dr. Cohen pointed out something very critical about the IQ being lowered and that leading to ADHD. People don't understand, and we don't, because we have to continue to become aware of, for every 5 deciliters of lead in your system, you lose an IQ point. And also knowing that, some of these things that we used to have, as they were saying, it used to be a time when mothers got WIC, they tested for lead. They're not doing that anymore. So we also have to hold the medical system, accountable, also thinking about the ways that we have to not only approach environmental racism and, petrochemical sites and prevent the erection of new petrochemical sites, but we also have to deal with the racism inside of the medical field. There should never be a time when someone is saying that a Black person or person of color or gender neutral, they're not getting the care that they need, not because they don't deserve it, but because someone has determined who deserves it and who's entitled to healthcare, when healthcare should be a human right. You know, good health should be a human right. Our children should be able to go to school and get education as a human right, not to have to go to school to fight. You know, you said what you said in the beginning, you said that a child's job is to play. And we don't, you know, children can't play anymore. The school system is even putting things in their parent handbooks, you know, where they're criminalizing our children. You know, we had this Toledo Safe School Ordinance that you know, we fought against some years ago. Why? Because it was criminalizing our children at a young age. One thing that came out too was that lead leads to criminalized behavior. There was a study performed by Dr. Morris Jenkins and Dr. Marilyn Wood at the University of Toledo. So why do I say all of this? Not, hopefully not to bore you, but I say it because when we think about our environment, we have to look at the fact of all of the things that occur in our environment. A lot of times you know, Dr. Cohen talked about mobilizing and engaging, and I'll add the word organizing. But when we come together and we come to this fight for power, we don't start at the federal level. What they've demonstrated is that our power and the way that we need to build for the solutions that we need is right at home. It's in our backyard. It's with our local city council. It's with our county commissioners. You know, it's with our mayor. It's with those individuals who, you know, have the ability to give what we need. And I'm hoping that this Lunch and Learn series, as you're learning about, you know, petrochemicals and the harms and ways to combat it in your everyday life, that you'll continue to stay with us, because what we want to do is to build out a policy agenda. What's the plan that we can replicate across the Ohio River Valley to where we are building out this coalition of voices? So number one, you know, you ask, how can you help with your physician? Talk about it. As people of color and Black people, we cannot go to the doctor with a shame-based mentality. We can no longer afford to be ashamed of the social ills and the social determinants that we incur because of superimposed things upon our lives, like poverty or, you know, all of these other, you know, environmental factors. The other part is tell your story beyond your physician's office. You know, again, one of the things that Black talks about is using your story or bringing your story forth as a precursor to policy making. Why is that important? Because we're the experts. You're the expert. You know what your community needs. You know what your child needs. You know what, and your story is your lived experience. And a lot of times, if we don't tell it, who knows it? Again, when we go about the fracking or we go about the region and why this work is so important in this region, especially for Black people or poor people, number one is poor people are not sitting here in competition with rich people. They're in competition with poor people. And so when you have things like the word Appalachia, which only makes people think about white poverty, we're already seeing where Blacks and whites are being pitted against one another, even in the struggle story, and it makes one person more savable than the other. And that's why Black has, Black and Rec, was launched, because of the fact that we have to tell the story so that we have resources allocated and access allocated to everyone. The other parts of this is making sure that you are educating yourselves and you are aware. What does this do for you? It helps us to move from needs-based advocacy to self-based advocacy. And this is another reason why we're having the Lunch and Learns around petrochemicals, because again, as Patty demonstrated, there is just so much where you live at. When you walk out your front door, you're at risk. When you get in your car, you're at risk. When you open your window, you're at risk. When you drive with your window down, you're at risk. Why should our lives be at risk because of someone else's greed or capitalistic mentality? So again, I want to thank you, and the risks are they're long. So please understand this. If you don't get anything else from me being long-winded, is that these things are not just intersectional, they're interdependent upon one another. And so you can't talk about health without talking about taxes. You can't talk about that without talking about food. You can't talk about that without talking about clean air and pollution. You can't talk about it without talking about all of the other issues. And so what we're doing here today is we're creating a conversation where we're creating a form of an eco conversation to build a stronger eco relationship that shows the interdependence of all of these things and the impact. So again, I want to thank Patty and Dr. Cohen for joining us. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us with this Lunch and Learn. We have these I believe every third Thursday of the month from 12 to 1:30. And we hope that you join us again. The link has already been put there. Ben, if you put it back in the link. I also encourage you, to go to Patty's website and learn more. She's authored 2 books. And if there's any information, Dr. Cohen, that you can share where, our participants can go to learn more about the work that you do, because we want to arm and equip, individuals. Also, what I ask that you do is, number 1, go to the Black Appalachian Coalition website. Check us out, think about whether or not you'd like to share your story around petrochemical, environmental harms, environmental racism, school to prison pipeline, or just the fact that you have a story that needs to be told and heard. And those are on our website. We also do GIS mapping. Follow us on Facebook, Black Appalachian Coalition. We have a Twitter and we have an Instagram. Not only that, I am proud to announce that we have finally launched our Black podcast, Black Remembering, highlighting the heavy and the hope. So if you just go to Apple, I'm not that well versed, but you go to some of those things like Spotify, you can type in Black Remembering. And we welcome, those of you, Dr. Cohen, Patty, and others in this audience, to be on the podcast. It's just another way of sharing our stories and bringing the hope as to what's going on. It's another way to mobilize, organize, engage, and activate one another, and to hear our voices, because your voice is important. I hope that when you leave this Lunch and Learn today, that number 1, you feel equipped to be able to talk to your physician and put a demand on the healthcare for you and your family and your community. And number 2, that you look in the mirror and you tell yourself, I matter, and I'm going to do whatever it takes for me to live my best life possible. And number 3, I'm going to smile, because I heard it's contagious and I want to spread some contagious joy. And so with that being said, I want to again thank everyone for joining us today. And we will send out the PowerPoint. We will send out the recording. And I'd like to invite you to our webinar. We're having a webinar next week on our tool. We're launching the Black Storytelling Toolkit, and it'll be a public-facing tool where individuals can use it within their policymaking, their organizing, speaking to your public officials, but it's there for you. And so as well, I believe Ben put that link in there. And so I'm going to stop because I'm being like an atypical preacher. They say, hey, I'm coming to my conclusion, and they keep on talking. But guess what? I'm going to stop talking and just say, have a wonderful, wonderful day. I wish you all a beautiful weekend. And again, thank you for being the best part of my day, and enjoy yourself for the rest of the day. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Marcia.
Have a good one, everybody.
I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
All righty.
Bye-bye.
Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.